There are calls for a major campaign to raise awareness of coercive control following the case of Lance Hart, who shot and killed his wife Claire and daughter Charlotte after he'd inflicted years of psychological abuse.
Lance Hart also took his own life on that day in July 2016. We can talk now to the family's surviving sons, Luke and Ryan. Good morning,
Good morning
to you both. I'm going to ask first of all, how are you?
We're actually doing quite well. We've been quite busy raising awareness this week, so we're quite tired, but it's been a productive week.
And Luke, why do you think, I mean, you have such a powerful story to tell. Why do you think it is important to tell this now? Because for 3 years, I think 3 years ago, the laws on coercive control were introduced, and that was the case of you and your family.
That's right. So we had actually only moved our mother and sister away from our father 5 days before he killed them both. We found out on the news app, where we both work in different countries, what had happened. And the first thing that struck us was just confusion, because our father had never been violent towards us. And then the violence seemed to come out of nowhere. He seemed to kill our mother and sister out of nowhere, because we'd always thought domestic abuse was about violence. But it's only since we were in the police station in Spalding, we looked up behind us, and 6 months before the coercive control legislation came out, and we saw financial abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, all the other mechanisms our father used to control our family. And at that moment, we realised our father's behaviour didn't come out of nowhere. He'd controlled us our entire lives, and that control had ratcheted up until he killed our mother and sister. And when you consider murder to be the ultimate act of control, suddenly what seemed to come out of nowhere made perfect sense to us, and that's what we're hoping to raise awareness of.
Ryan, one of the things I know you've talked about already is the notion from the outside looking in, there were no signs, effectively, as to what was happening within the household. Can you give people a sense of the kind of thing you were witnessing but maybe didn't realise at the time?
Yeah, so I think what is key is to understand that coercive control isn't so much what is done to you, but what you cannot do yourself. So our father slowly took away our freedoms. So for one, he kept us financially poor. He wasted and gambled money, so we had no money to spend. And he used that as an excuse why we couldn't go and see friends, why we couldn't take part in sports. And over time, we ended up restricting our own social lives because we felt we couldn't actually take part in friendships in society. And over the decades of that slow abuse, we ended up controlling ourselves and limiting our life. And the reason we moved our mum and sister away from the family home wasn't because we were scared our father would kill them, but because we were scared they could never live when they were in the home with him.
And you'd left home by this point?
We had left home, yeah, as Luke said, only 5 days before he killed them. But we found out in the police investigation he was planning on killing all of us for months before we even planned to move out. Because that control over our lives, he could see that slowly disappearing because we were able to provide financially for our mum and our sister.
It's for anyone watching who may be in this situation, and like you two didn't really know you were in a coercive, abusive relationship.
Yeah.
There are little things that happen. I mean, you've mentioned a couple. There was an incident I read about, or a form of routine, your daily tea at 4:15 instead of 4:30. Can you explain
Well,
that?
yeah, so our father almost created a whole system of laws in the house that we had to abide by. And they were designed so we could never meet them. So we always had an excuse to basically just yell at us. So the bus always got in at 4:30, but our father from school, right, and our father always cooked dinner for 4:15. So he either burnt it and then blamed us when we turned up and the food was black, or he'd put it on the plate, ate his, ours was cold, and he would yell at us. And we just couldn't make the bus get there any earlier. But it was those small things where eventually you begin to believe you're the problem because you're always doing something wrong. You're always to blame. All these things are happening that are your fault. And that's what the abuser tells you.
But you were high achievers at school as well, weren't you? You did really well in school. So, and the point being that perhaps teachers, and I'm not passing any criticism onto the education system in this sense, but it wasn't something to look at. You weren't going to be considered as problem children.
Yeah, so that's one key issue we want to raise, is a stereotype of an abuser is not necessarily someone who's violent, who creates those physical scars and bruises. And also, as pupils, we weren't the snapping, like, detention pupils. We were overly compliant and quiet and highly successful, not out of determination, but because we were afraid of failure. And that comes from our home environment, where we could not fail at home. That wasn't an option. And so in our school life, we were those same kids who just got our heads down and worked hard because we had no other option. And I think what is key is we need to change the stereotypes we're looking out for in abusers and also victims. Not all victims are going to be aggressive. They might be if they're responding to physical attacks, but our environment was cultivated over decades, so we slowly accustomed and adapted to be able to survive. And so we became, as you said, overly compliant and fearful. And that made us safe at home. And that necessarily didn't show itself in school in the stereotypical ways.
I mean, you've both been very brave and very honest, and you know, the way you tell the story of what happened will be impacting. I just wonder what, I'm assuming that a lot of people have responded, have they? Because as you say right at the beginning, you wouldn't know from the outside. If this is happening in a household, as it was in yours, you may well not know. These could be the people living next door to you. They could be members of your own family. You just wouldn't know.
And that's the thing, is we lived with a murderer for 25 years and didn't know. The services saw our family, didn't know. Our friends saw our family and didn't know. Because I think when we talk about domestic abuse, we talk about violence, but domestic abuse is about control. Violence is what abusers use to get control. It's a subset of control. And when you take a step back and talk about control, it all makes sense. And I think that's one of the messages we'd like to convey, is that in the media as well, sometimes the media are part of society, they assume abusers are violent men who are angry, who've lost it, and they're violent out of anger and emotion. But our father was cold-blooded, it was calculated, it was based on beliefs and control.
Can I ask one thing, is that if someone is in that circumstance, there will be people listening to this even now thinking, I hear some of the things you're saying correspond with our lives. They might be thinking, what do I do? Do I go and see? I go to the police and I say, do you know what, my dad or whoever it is in the family is stopping us from doing things sometimes. And in their head they might be thinking, it just doesn't sound like much. You know it was an enormous thing.
Yeah.
But they might be wary of thinking, it just sounds like we're not, you know, what's the problem?
I think we would encourage anyone with any concerns, not only in themselves but in their friends, to call the National Domestic Violence Helpline and just express what you've seen, because by saying it's not that bad, that's what we've said our entire lives, it's not that bad. We kept thinking our lives could be worse. And that's not how people should be living, by thinking it could be worse. We all deserve to live freely and happily. And I think if you are seeing some of those elements that we talk about, talk to the experts and raise your concerns, and don't just live and give in to that life that you may have ended up in.
And also one thing in our case is when women leave, that's when they're most likely to be killed by their partners. So we didn't realise. And actually, if you think you're being abused, don't suddenly leave, because that can trigger that loss of control in the men. They feel that you're leaving as a rebuttal to their control, and that can make you in quite danger.
There is a great fear to, for anyone who is watching who wants to make their situation known of the consequences, but also life after. How long has it taken for you to kind of get to this very composed and compassionate place?
So I think what was key for us was when we lost Mum and Charlotte, we lost our purpose in life. And it wasn't until we started speaking out about a year and a half after the murders that we started to find new meaning. And we started to, I guess, make something good out of what happened. We didn't want our father to win, essentially. Had we just lived a life of regret and sadness, he would have essentially won in destroying our lives too. So what we tried to do is live a life which is meaningful, that Mum and Charlotte would be proud of. And I think part of that is speaking out about what we've suffered to hopefully raise awareness. Part of that is how we wrote our own book, Operation Lighthouse, to share our story more widely. And we hope to just go into schools maybe one day, just talk to anyone who's willing to listen to us, so we can do what we can to hopefully make sure our story isn't repeated again.
Well, I'm sure I speak on behalf of a lot of people watching you, amazed by your composure. And, you know, it's quite remarkable how you tell your story. It will impact on a lot of people.
I think you've helped someone today. You must have done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If you've been affected by any of the issues that we've just spoken about, do visit BBC's Action Line website, bbc.co.uk/Action Line, where information is available.